There's an old Yiddish expression that says, I don't know who it was that discovered water, but whoever it was wasn't a fish, right? It's awfully hard to discover something that you're in the middle of. So this year, Sphinx decided to end SphinxCon with a view from across the pond. So we have 4 colleagues who are not Americans, who've been participating in the past 2 days of conversations, who've been listening and watching and thinking with their specific lenses, who are going to help reflect us back to us through the work that they've been doing. So please help me in please join me in welcoming, is what I think I meant to say, Robert Adadrian, Marshall Marcus, Paul Smith, and Alexandra Soom. Bring them to the stage with a warm welcome.
Hi, Jamie.
All right. So I think we're going to run this one slightly differently than the typical format, because I think there's a lot of foundational work that we need to do, because there are a lot of concepts and words that we've been using in an American context that work very differently in a UK or in a European context. So let me start maybe with Robert at the end, and let me ask you to do 2 things. Number 1, in your work, where you're positioned, when you think through issues of diversity, issues of inclusion, issues of equity, what are you talking about? What's included in that for you?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a great place to start, I think, because this is my first visit to America, by the way, so it's great to be here.
Yeah. Welcome. Give them a welcome.
Yeah, I feel very welcome.
Welcome to the farm.
And Jamie and I were speaking a little bit about racial equity and race politics in the US, and how here it's quite singular in some ways. So when we're talking about racial policy and diversity from that, we're really talking about an African American and Hispanic issue. When in the UK I'm writing a funding application for a project that I'm starting, or trying to get some interest in a new idea, and I talk about diversity, the starting point could be much broader. So I might be talking about LGBT issues or gender equality. I'll definitely be talking about social mobility and educational background. And I think there's something really wonderful about looking at these multiple diversities and seeing what we can learn from them that informs the work wherever we are. And if I can just take a moment, one particular area which has always been a fascination to me is to do with gender equality in classical music. So hands up in the audience, how many of you can name a female conductor? Okay, keep your hands in the air if you're not thinking about Marin Alsop right now. Okay, well, I'm impressed. The reality is that in the UK, we don't do gender equality in classical music that well. And I can talk about that as my context. I'm sure there are lots of similarities in the US. But actually, it's not an issue of the pipeline, which we were talking about yesterday, because since the late 19th century, women have been overrepresented in conservatoires. In our youth ensembles, over 62% of the young musicians are female, which is great. But something happens when we enter into the professional world. All of these women who've had an incredible education and a wonderful access to high-quality music education disappear somehow. Where do they go? Composers is a great example. Only 14% of composers active in the UK are women. 14%. We've just spoken about conductors. This percentage is shocking. Actually, I'm going to make sure I get this one absolutely right because it's important. 1.4% of conductors working in the UK are women. 1.4%. We've done slightly better in terms of the orchestral world. Amongst rank and file musicians, about 42% of women are active. That's not bad. But think about the positions of leadership and authority. Amongst the principals, section leaders of our orchestras, only 26% are women. And then we look at artistic directors and CEOs, and the percentages get even lower. 2.5% of our artistic directors in the UK are women. And I think that it's important for us to learn lessons about things that have worked well and things that haven't worked well in context to do with diversity and integration, so that we don't repeat the mistakes that have happened in the past and so that we can learn lessons in the future. This morning I went to a really fascinating seminar that was run by some wonderful, wonderful people who spoke very eloquently and powerfully about the power of music education. And one lady said that in Boston, where she presides, the numbers of children who had participated in arts education had risen from 62% to 97%. And you know, she received a warm American round of applause, and I joined in, because that's fantastic. It's a really wonderful thing. But at the same time, my heart sank a little bit, because I thought, you know, that's not the solution. Music education is not the solution to the lack of diversity in our ensembles. And I know that because for the past 100 years, women have had an incredible music education, yet they're still not fully represented in the ensembles in the UK. So we need to find more robust and more integrated ways of solving these complicated problems, because the solutions are also complicated. And we must think about ways to partner with and collaborate with others to find solutions to those problems. So coming back to your original point, what do I think about racial equity and diversity, and how is it different in the UK, in the US? It's different because we're very different civilizations, we're very different people groups. But the positive thing is that the way we solve problems of lack of integration and lack of diversity are the same. We have to be open-minded, we have to be open-hearted, and we have to learn what it means to really collaborate. Because the experience that I have on my own is not enough to solve the problems of, you know, the lack of diversity in, say, the London Philharmonic Orchestra or, you know, my own organisation. But together with partners who have complementary skills to mine and complementary visions, that's where the solutions can sometimes begin to be found. And hopefully I'll get an opportunity to talk a little bit more about my own organisation later on.
Yeah, that's great. We'll come back to that. Thank you. Marshall, you're running the European Union Youth Orchestra. So there's a very different geography you're dealing with. There's a very different network. There's a very different network of networks. Talk a little bit about how that functions, how you operate the geography, the networks, the structures that are in place.
Thanks very much. Just before I delve into that, I just first of all want to echo exactly what you were saying, Rob, about the pattern of diversity for the UK. By the way, the slides that you saw up till now were slides I put together for the beginning. And one of the reasons I did that was to look at some of the proportions behind what Rob was talking about. So, you know, it's true that in the UK, let's say you're talking about approximately 87% white people. In London, that goes down to a much lower percentage. The biggest percentage that interests me on those figures from the 2014 census I took was that the percentage of people on the census who are in poverty, the bottom line, is over 33%. And that's measured by the number of kids who are having free school meals and various things of that sort. So if you look in the UK at who's not getting a slice of the pie, actually these here are some of the UK diversity categories, and you referred to some of these. I must say, in terms of the UK, I have to think in these terms: ethnicity, gender, disability, sexual orientation, poverty. These are all things which, if you really want to try and dissolve the power structures so that we all get a fairer chance equally at things like culture and in society. That's my way of looking at it, and I'm fascinated that obviously I come in here that in Houston, for example, there's over 40% Latino population, what was it, over 20% black. That really changes how you think in terms of the categories. So for the UK, I would say that's how we kind of think about that. You were asking me about the European Union Youth Orchestra and you know, the networks. And there again, there is a massively different sense of what you might mean by diversity. So very often, let's say I'm dealing with young players. The orchestra has got players up to the age of 26. We audition every year in 28 EU countries. So we're hopefully hoovering up the best players, whatever that means, in the EU from these various countries. If we do some education work, then those who come from the UK, from Belgium, from France, have a completely different sense of what it is to go into a school to do some work than those who come from other kinds of societies. You think about a country like Romania or Bulgaria or Malta or Cyprus, and they're far more homogeneous societies. So homogeneous, by the way, that as we get into a lot of the problems we have in Europe over, for example, the refugee crisis, you will get prime ministers of countries there saying, well, we'll take some refugees, but they have to be Christian. We're not having any Muslims. And I want to bring this kind of thing onto the table because in Europe, this is our reality. And it's a very powerful crisis at the moment, and it has to inform how you think about how you work with diversity. I have a friend who's a photographer. She's just gone to France to do a project filming and photographing what's called the jungle in Calais. So this is a city where the trains whiz by between London, Paris, and Brussels. And outside those trains, there are now thousands of people who've made their way from southern Europe, from the Middle East. They're trying to get into the UK and other places. Last week, the Globe, our great Shakespearean theatre company, went there and did a performance of Hamlet. And the kind of issues we have in Europe with 40-odd countries, hundreds of millions of people from different ethnicities who often are not even able to have the concept of, I mean, you talk a lot here about the hood and the community. You know, there are many people now on the fringes of Europe who don't have a community. And so I think, when I think of that area of challenge, and then I come back to 4,000 or 5,000 young players who audition for the European Union Youth Orchestra every year from 28 different countries, it's quite a challenge, I have to confess, putting together those two realities, which are hugely differentiated. So, you know, those are just a few of the issues I would say that we're beginning to face. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. Paul, I was talking with a colleague a year ago or something who had lived both in England and in Texas. And we asked him to sort of tell us what the difference was between England and Texas. And he thought for a minute, and he gave what I thought was the best answer I've ever heard, which is that in England, 100 miles is a long ways away. And in Texas, 100 years is a long time ago, right? We're still a young country, relatively speaking. Time works very differently in the UK. There are very different timelines. And there are very different power structures, right? Power plays out in some very different ways. Help us begin understanding time frame and power from the UK point of view.
Okay.
Tiny questions.
I've got 3 minutes, haven't I?
Yeah, exactly right.
It's very interesting because what you're saying there, Jamie, is at the heart of this question, this nexus of culture, inclusion, diversity, and power, which I think is the subtitle, somewhere in the words in the subtitle of our session at the moment. We are recognizing, I think, that the big things that determine world issues in this new century and millennium are fundamentally culturally based. And that includes things like legacy and history and identity and religion and different value systems. And in particular, I think, the questions that surround those great cultural questions, what is home? What do I call home? Who do I include in my home? Who is the other? And all the questions of mobility in the modern world, including immigration, refugeeism, changing diasporas, changing demographies, which affect the nature of home and community. I think something that has happened since, I suppose, that iconic year of 2001, is that culture and the arts, of course, I see as the most potent, powerful, and individualistic means of understanding and exploring culture. But culture has gone from the margins, even in the views of the politicians, and has gone to the core of world issues and geopolitics. It's as if we suddenly realize that the politics, the economics of the day, which most people are most transfixed by, are like the surface choppy waves on an ocean, of which the deep undertows which are causing those waves are the cultural and legacy aspects. And so I think it's very, and I think at the heart of most geopolitical issues, and mine is an organization, incidentally, which is Britain's official agency for what we call international cultural relations and international cultural collaboration. So we're very interested in the diversity of the world. At the heart of most, if not all, serious issues in the world today, including the crisis issues and the conflict issues, are questions of diversity, questions of the extent to which different peoples would tolerate other peoples' diversities, differences, distinctions, lovely word, and inclusion and exclusion. And I think you see it even in, interestingly, in the way nations do or don't see themselves as cultural, to use Marshall's words, homogeneities, and whether they break up or not. It's very interesting. If I can come back to Europe, you know, there are movements of secession in Europe. In my own country, Scotland, as most of you all know, tried to secede and form its own nation. Belgium is a country that could break up. Catalonia and the Basque region in Spain, and so on and so forth. The Crimea moving back to Russia. What has been the primary determinants of those movements has not been fundamentally political or even economic. It has been cultural. The fracture lines are lines of old languages, old histories, and a different sense of cultural identity. And I think that kind of recognition has to play into the heart of all of us who work in the arts. The same applies in this continent, perhaps not so much in Texas, but in, you know, you look to Canada. It's not Ontario that would ever dream of trying to diverge from Canada. It is the linguistically, culturally distinct and different Quebec. And then, of course, when we look more painfully to the Kurds and the Palestinians and so on, then we suddenly realize that this kind of issue is at the heart of world politics and the big fractures that are determining some of the big issues of our day. So I see an international connection very much between culture and politics.
Thank you.
Culture and power.
Alexandra, we've talked a lot about administrators over the past 2 days. We've talked a lot about artists over the past 2 days. And the third A has only come up a few times, which is audience. But that's really your obsession at the moment. That's your focus.
Yes.
Talk to us, share with us a little bit about your work, how you arrived at it, and what you're doing in terms of that.
Right. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's the first time I'm on stage. Without my violin, it feels very strange. I feel like I have to hold something, and all I have is my brain. So I'll try my best. It's also not my native language. But anyway, it's such an honor to be here amongst all of you. And I was born in Moscow in a family of musicians, and grew up in the south of France, and started the violin with my dad when I was 5 years old. And that's our tree. That's my foundation. It's called Espérance Arts. I'll talk about it in a minute. So everything was going kind of according to the plan. You know, I moved to Vienna to study there when I was 10 years old. I studied there 12 years. And the plan was, I think, to, you know, everyone wanted me to become this, you know, big soloist and perform in big halls and with wonderful orchestras and maestros. And that's exactly what happened. And for a while, I was really, really happy about it. I'm still extremely grateful. But there was a paradox that, you know, arose when I was around 15, 16. So I was playing, you know, with these incredible people in these incredible places, doing exactly what I've always wanted to do. And there was something missing. I missed the link to the audience so badly. And I'm someone who really gives everything on stage. And of course, we receive a lot as a musician. But I wanted to know the individual story of each person. I'm such a curious person, and I really want to know everything about everyone. And I'm also extremely impatient, which doesn't make it really easier. So I started to miss something really badly, and I started to perform for homeless people and in hospitals, and you know, for kids in need. And then I really found, wow, this is so different. Actually, I found out I was playing sometimes better in those structures, which was really interesting, right? Because it's such a different, I mean, you work all your life to get somewhere, and then you realize when you don't need to prove anything, your art changes and who you are changes. And when you speak about diversity, I really see that kind of triangle of 3 A's: diversity of artists, audience, and arts themselves. And once you change one of these angles of this triangle, the 2 others shift too. And I find it incredible. So along the way, I met 2 amazing women, Maria and Paloma, who have been since then my older sisters and big inspiration. And 4 years ago, we have founded Esperance Arts. I think you can start rolling the clip. Thank you. And so over the last 4 years, we have now 40 artists playing regularly in homeless shelters, for kids in need, in hospitals, and for all kinds of people who are just excluded. And yeah, I mean, now I balance my life between solo career, teaching, and philanthropy. And I'm so proud that all our artists are world-class photographers, dancers, musicians, all kinds of arts. That's why there's an S to the arts, yeah. And so we have partnerships with structures, and we come back. For me, it was impossible to just come one time and play and say thank you, bye. I mean, I think the key thing here is really to build something on the very long term, on a human basis, which doesn't involve judgment or seek for perfection of any kind, because who you are is already a perfection in some way. And yeah, so I'm just very grateful that artists join us, and that I think the word success means something different now than it has been for the other generations. For me, my own personal success isn't success anymore. So I seek collective success as a society, as a group of people, and I've met people who felt the same way. So I'm happy there's this new wave of artists that, for whom it's just not enough to be successful. Doesn't mean that we give that up. I wouldn't give that up. I think one thing helps the other. So I think all the artists that have participated at Esperance Arts concerts, they definitely say that they play better later, and they feel the music differently, and so yeah.
I think that's great. I want to invite you guys to join us in the conversation, so feel free to think your thoughts, get your questions, come up to the mics. We've heard a little bit about Esperanza Arts and the performances, so that art remains special, but it need not be rare, right? It can be everywhere, it can be present. We've heard a little bit about the British Council and the International Cultural Exchange in doing that. We've heard about the European Youth Orchestra, and my favorite UK verb, hoovering up the best young musicians from all over the EU. We didn't really get a chance, Rob, to hear about London Music Masters. So as folks are gathering their thoughts and thinking that through, will you give us this sort of plug for London Music Masters and the work that you're doing?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the great things, actually, is that that there's a lot of connection on this stage. So Sasha was one of our award holders, which we're really delighted about. And we also awarded a prize to Elena Uriosti, who will be very well known to Sphinx regulars, as she was one of the first laureates of the Sphinx Prize. And at London Music Masters, we seek to tackle the diversity issues that we have in the UK from multiple levels. So we work with incredible young artists like Sasha and Elena, and we support their careers, because if we believe in art, then we have to believe in the furtherance of it. And young musicians find it difficult to maintain and build careers, and part of what we can do as a cultural sector is support that. Not only do we support them in the development and furtherance of their own artistic identity, but we with Sasha, it's almost not necessary, but we try and facilitate opportunities for them to develop their skills as ambassadors and communicators and educators. So we will bring them into our schools and into our communities to be an inspiration, to be a role model to young people around the communities, which are around our concert halls. And it's been fascinating hearing what DSO is doing by reaching out beyond the hall into the community. And then a major part of our work is working in schools with children. So over the past 7 years, we've worked with over 1,000 children, training them to become musicians, because I'm really passionate about bringing children into the audience, but I'm more passionate about bringing children from disaffected communities into concert halls as performers. And I think it's really important that as cultural leaders, which you are out here, that you take it seriously, your responsibility to train up the next generation of artists, so that you say, actually, let's look beyond beyond the platform, look into the audience, look into the community, and say, how can we make a pathway for you to come from your community into the concert hall and onto the stage, so that in 20 years' time you are creating the music that we are listening to. So we run long-term programs which span for many, many years. We start with the children when they're 4 years old, and we send them off into their futures when they're 11 and they go on to secondary school. And one of the things that we've tried hard to do is not to simply find the solution through education alone, but to use our partnerships with conservatoires and orchestras to try and find a multifaceted approach to the problem. We heard a lot yesterday in one of the sessions about this issue with the pipeline, which I brought up earlier. Orchestras are saying, well, we're elite, world-class institutions, if you will. We have to find musicians who can maintain our standards. Where are the musicians of colour that do that? They turn to the conservatoires. The conservatoires say, we're world-class institutions. We need to maintain our standards. How can we find artists from diverse communities who can do that for us? And in the UK, this conversation happens a lot. And about 10 years ago, the founder of my charity started having that conversation with some seriousness. And so she got the principal of a leading conservatoire, the artistic director of a leading London orchestra, and herself in a room, and she said, well, let's try and find solutions together. And she went to the orchestra and said, what you're really good at is having a place in the community. You actually know the community. You can help us find schools and people who can enable us to build relationships there. She said to the conservatoires, what you're really good at is teaching. Come and teach with us, partner with us, and teach the children in these communities that have been opened to us by the orchestra. And she said, what I can do, and her name is Victoria Roby, and she is chair of the London Philharmonic Orchestra. She said, what I can do is bring passion and vision and access to finance. And it's been my privilege over the past few years as executive director of the orchestra to facilitate more of these opportunities where different organizations can come together and bring their skills and their vision into one space so that we can find complex solutions to the complex issues of the lack of diversity in our major ensembles.
I think that's great. Thank you so much. Please join the conversation.
Hi, my name is Jason Tseng from Fractured Atlas. I wanted to ask specifically about a report that came out of the Warwick Commission in early last year, in February 2015, that found the wealthiest 8% of British folks were making up over almost a third of live theater audiences in general. And I was wondering specifically how the shift of the increasing privatization of the cultural funding in the UK, kind of taking on an American model, is affecting that very needed kind of reassessment of the relationship of public institutions and the public.
Marshall, you got the question you wanted.
That's very nice. Thank you very much for asking that question, because obviously some of my slides referred to the Warwick Commission report. Yeah, it was actually a damning moment, in my opinion, when that report came out. It's put together by some very eminent, quite a large, about 200 or so eminent people, about the state of culture and creativity in the UK. And some remarkable facts emerged, like in the last 5 years, there's actually been a decrease in diverse Black, Asian, and disability in the workforce, for example. There are facts, I think, some of that came out, like, visits to museums, 87% from the more affluent families, down to 13% for the less affluent. And it was, I'm amazed how much that's just now sailed through the news and gone, because in the UK, there's been a huge amount, the last 20 years or so, there's been a huge amount of very interesting projects. I mean, LMM you've talked about. There are 40, 50, 60 of these projects in a small country like the UK, and yet it's not changing the face of how these things work. And actually, it's becoming even worse. And so there is a huge question there. I mean, it's very interesting that you might have implied that somehow the slight move towards private funding for the arts may have affected this. I'm not sure that is so. But it might be worth alighting just for a moment on something which is so hugely different between the US and the UK and Europe about funding. And it's a question I always want to ask American audiences. In the UK, or let me take Europe as an example. Again, one of my slides was showing that the EU, the European Union, is funding culture and new media over a 7-year period through its Creative Europe program. So this is apart from what any governments give. The EU is giving more than $1.5 billion of funding for cultural products. Now, that's quite an extraordinary figure, I think, when you look at how things work in the States. So you have to imagine that in the States you have a Minister of Culture who's going to actually give out that kind of money for culture. And not only are they going to do that, but the government, or the EU, is going to put down an agenda for how you get that money. Now, the European Union Youth Orchestra used to get its funding through something called the Ambassadors Programme. It was a typical high-end thing. We went round as cultural ambassadors playing our old European music very well. That doesn't happen anymore. There is now something which is a partnership funding, and there's an agenda and criteria, quite as it should be, of course, which means that we have to show what is our audience development strategy? How are we going to reach new audiences? How are we going to reach people who have less access to culture? In the UK, the Arts Council, which again has a large portfolio of funding, if you want to have Arts Council funding, you better have your policies on all sorts of things, from how you look after kids to how you are showing diversity. And again, there's a slide of Ed Vasey, who's currently the Minister of Culture, who went to the Association of British Orchestras conference, like the League of American Orchestras, and he basically said, guys, you're not doing well enough. You need to bring the diversity into your orchestras. So I want you to imagine for a moment that and by the way, he's the Conservative Party, so that's like a major league Republican, I won't say Trump, but a major league one, turning up and saying to the League, guys, I'm here to look at the way that the US government uses its funding to bring diversity to the orchestral networks. It's a very different space we occupy. And I would like to know from Americans, why don't you try and make sure that your US government it involves itself in that way? It's a naive question, I'm aware.
That's excellent. Please join us.
Hi, Victor Sawyer from the Memphis Music Initiative. Here in the U.S., sports, a lot of youth participate in sports activities within their schools. There are plenty of leagues. And within those sports leagues, there's not really an illusion that most of those students are going to transition into becoming pro football players or pro basketball players. However, when it comes to music, something that's proven to increase test scores and youth outcomes in almost every single study, as soon as you approach a parent and say, hey, we really want to start a program, they immediately say, well, I don't know if my son or daughter can make a career out of this, but you never see that line of questioning in sports, or not as much. I'm wondering, do you find the same problem in Europe, and if so, what are some strategies around that?
I mean, very, very much so. And I think sport has one thing which music doesn't have, which is that everyone kind of knows that it's a good idea to do exercise, right? So there are lots of benefits for generally exercising, and so I think lots of sport kind of sneaks in under that radar. One of the issues that you touched on was parental engagement and trying to convince the parents that it's a worthwhile activity for children to get involved in music. And one of the key strategies I would say to that is think long term. Music education in the UK is hamstrung by a short-termism, which ties up money and ties up other types of resource. And the reality is that you might not change the perspective of the parents that you're dealing with now, and I might not change the perspective of the parents that are currently coming through my programs. But the children that I'm working with will, in 15, 20 years' time, become the parents of the next generation. And it's their children that are my target, because their children will, they'll still be programs like the ones that we're doing in 20 years' time, and they will take home their violin or their trombone, and their parents will understand, because they've had the experience. So they are part of the family. They have enriched the family of classical music by their presence. And so when their children come home, they'll be able to say, yes, I'm on the inside. Like, I know what this is about. I'm happy for you to participate because it did me some good. It will do you some good. So think long term.
Yeah. Actually, I could just very briefly come in on that. I back in the dinosaur age of the 1980s, when I was a violinist and doing education work in schools, I was astounded in the UK by how you'd work with non-musician kids. And I had parents who would regularly come up afterwards and say, how does this happen? Bob at home is a mess. He's going all over doing everything. He's concentrating for 20 minutes doing this. And I found that the parents actually really did notice and were on, you're onto something in that kind of work you're doing in schools. But
I think the challenge is is perhaps slightly broader when you're thinking about how you can develop musicians with a strong skill base. So, I mean, when you're doing kind of a broad arts-based curriculum, you know, absolutely it's very positive and bring people in to see the activities that you're doing. But when you're saying actually the benefit that you get from participating in music comes from the rigor and the regularity and the quality of the teaching. And in order for that to really work, parents, I need you to be involved. You know, I need you to be helping your child to practice. I need you to be supporting in lots of ways. And that can be difficult because we're inviting parents into an educational space that they might not feel comfortable with themselves. So absolutely, when they see their child performing on stage, they get it and they see it. Yeah. And when I say, and this is going to be 7 more years of hard work, are you up for that journey? Sometimes then that's a longer conversation.
That's great, Sasha, yeah.
Yes, I'm the godmother for El Sistema in France, and we just started, so we're at the very, very beginning of all of this. But I've been going to a school, I mean, as much as I could with the first kids, you know, that come from, you know, really very difficult background. Almost all of them are white. We don't have, as you said, really not the same meaning of diversity in France. But all these kids came from really hard backgrounds, and they were having lessons and living in the school. So I said we have to have at least 2 hours of music every day, 5 days a week. You know, coming from a Russian school of music, like you have to practice as much as possible. So they all practice, but when they come home for the weekend, a lot of their parents don't want them to practice because the parents watch TV all day long and the parents don't read. And so the biggest problem with these kids were that they don't know what silence is, and they don't understand that silence is the most important thing in music. I mean, in my opinion, if you can't be silent, just listen, and then the music arises. So just to calm those kids, I mean, it took us like 1 hour, and then they would calm for 10 seconds. It was a disaster. But actually, after a few years, the children came home and said, you know what, Mom, I really want to practice my trumpet. I really want to practice my cello. And then, you know, after a while, the parents started liking it. And so the kids started to change their families. And I think that's what's going to happen, that the next generation will kind of help us and teach us.
It's fabulous. Yeah, excellent. Please join us.
Hi. I have, first of all, my name is Evan Ware. I'm with the Rachel Barton Pine Foundation. I'm the managing editor for a project that we call Music by Black Composers, which I'll get into in just a second. I'm a graduate of the University of Michigan in theory and composition. I did 2 dissertations. In my free time, I enjoy long walks on the beach because I have so much of it. I just wanted to bring up an issue that strikes really to the heart of our project. So our project, we realized that in the 15 top methods for string players to learn, there isn't a single piece by a black composer represented, not one. And so we decided that we would create supplements for each one of these, that you could use graded supplements for each instrument, but featured only music by black composers, and broadly defined from anywhere in the world. And in doing the research, I've been at this job for about 9 months now. In doing the research, one thing that I've come to realize is that programming is a huge issue. Take Florence Price's Symphony in E minor, an absolutely fantastic piece of music that is currently not published. And it should be a warhorse of every American orchestra from coast to coast, yet it isn't. It's barely known and it's barely played. And I think the canon, if we're ever to disrupt anything, the canon is one of the most important things that we have to disrupt. It is a story. And classical music, the history of classical music as we know it, isn't really the real history. Right? There's black composers going back 350 years. Some working in South America. I found a violin duet by a Venezuelan composer written in 1790, and I got a high quality scan from the National Archives in Venezuela of that piece. It was fantastic. But I think this is more of a comment really than a question. But I think that programming is something that we really need to talk about. and the canon, and the way the canon strangles our diversity is something that really needs to be talked about. So react as you will. Thank you.
I think that's great. Let's take one last comment, and then we'll come up here and we'll do sort of.
one over here.
I'm sorry. Sorry. My chair was angled. Well, two last ones. So let me come here, and then we'll come back here. No, let me, please.
I don't have a question. I have a comment. I'm Robin Walker Murphy, the Director of Membership Development and Engagement at the National Guild, but I spent about a decade of my life as the director of the Dreamyard Arts Center in the Bronx. And I want to talk about this. Oh, Dreamyard, yes. And I want to talk about this issue of parent engagement with something that's very dear and close to my heart. All the time that I was at the Dreamyard Arts Center in the Bronx, parents flooded through our doors, demanding arts education for their young people, really excited about their young people engaging in the arts. And one of the reasons why is that we made sure that we did parent outreach. We made sure that we created an environment where parents felt welcome, because a lot of times parents go to these schools and they're not welcome in the schools, whether it is because of biases, whether it's because they speak a different language. So we made sure that we called our parents. We didn't just call them when there was something wrong. Sometimes we called to say how great their student was doing. And clearly we made sure that we had a relationship with the parents to say, we want you here. And we didn't have a preconceived notion or a bias about what they would appreciate about the arts or not. So I would say, please check yourself. Check the way that you feel about the communities where you work. Check your preconceived notions about who you think is going to be into the arts or not into the arts, because people can sense how you feel about them. No one is stupid. They can tell that you're judging them. And so they may not want to be in your space. So I'm very, very, very passionate about parent involvement, because I've seen parents who work 2, 3, 4, 5 jobs. They may not have time to sit there all day with their student while they're practicing their work. They may not have that time. But if they know that you are seeing them as a partner and you're understanding all the various circumstances that may keep them, and the privileges that some parents have to sit there and be at all the recitals. Everybody can't do that. Everybody does not have that privilege. But it does not mean that they don't care. It doesn't mean they don't appreciate it. It's not an indication of the kind of education that they have. So I want you to put the onus back on yourselves to check the work that you're doing and do better.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to take this last one, then we're going to close it up. I'm so sorry.
My name is Marianne Shalino from Shalino Artist Management. I represent Elena Urioste, and I want to thank you, Robert, and London Music Masters and Victoria, because Elena has really moved into the stratosphere in part because of you and also because of the Sphinx organization. And so I really have a comment. I don't have a question. I just want everybody here to know what Sphinx and London Music Masters has done for the career of Elena Urioste. It's really tough for an American artist to get known in the UK, and you guys helped to open that door for her. And with that, she went on to become a BBC Radio 3 New Generation artist, and then got British representation with Ingpen and Williams. And now she'll be making her debut with the Halle in the spring, and next fall we'll be performing with Sir Mark Elder with the Halle in the UK. And then, of course, that's had wonderful spillover effect because it bounces back to the States, and I hope what we're doing here bounces back to her career in Europe. But I wanted to thank you and the Sphinx organization to show what this kind of collaboration can do for a young person's career. I certainly hope that she's given back to you guys. I know she's given back to you, and I was over there and watching what she had done with the young kids and over in the UK, and I certainly know about what she's done here in the United States. So a hearty thank you to you and the Sphinx organization.
Excellent. Thank you. Do you have a quick last closing thing for us? All right, excellent, please.
Okay, hi, my name is Paula Marquez. I'm a composer, alive. I do have a quick question. Which artifacts or which suggestions you do to help composers to get out from the invisibility we have, because we are no performers officially, to become more part of the philanthropic world? I'm a social worker and I'm a composer, and I'm trying to figure out my way in this weird transition world. But I notice we are talking about a lot of performers, a lot of business people, and we are kind of in between because we are invisible, technically. That's my question.
Excellent, thank you. I think there's a lot about programming, a lot about repertory, a lot about the canon that the gentleman brought up that I would love to see us pick up more in future Sphinx conversations and others, because I think that's an important piece. So the four of you have been listening over the last 2 days. You've been thinking about it through your lens. We're wanting to ignite this audience to action. Think about something what's something you've seen that excites you? What's some hope? What's some optimism? What's some action? I want to leave us, you guys, I think, all said last night, we want to leave on an optimistic note. So reflect back something that the last 2 days of conversation have been getting right. What's something right track in this country? We'll start with Sasha and we'll just go down.
I'm fascinated by how further you are in certain things, behind in some others. You're so much further in the way you speak about things. For instance, just to say black community is not possible in France. It's like, it's just not possible to say these words. Even the word black is almost impossible to say. So we've got a very long way to go, because people feel offended by everything. I don't know if it's because, we have so much literature or our relationship to the word is so different. But here I feel that actions matter more than words, and that makes me so happy. Even though words matter, of course, I think if you have the fear of saying anything and how you're going to be looked, you can't move. So that's something every time I come to the US, I take this wave and I feel so much better and try to take that with me in Europe and change things there. So I think that's really wonderful. That's something that just brings a lot of joy to me.
Thank you. Paul?
I think I'm very excited in the US by what I do see as a greater willingness to challenge assumptions around the canon, but also assumptions not about the program and the contents, but assumptions around audience, and to constantly be rethinking that in the end it's the diversification of audience that actually makes for the diversification of the arts itself. And I'll just quickly mention one program which my organization has tried to catalyze here in the United States, which we've been thrilled to see the receptivity to it, and it's what we call relaxed performances. And it's a concept that we need to break down the ossification of how it's assumed, what are the protocols that have to apply, particularly in the Western world, when you are an audience to a performance. And it's trying to enable those, in my country, 1 in 10 people who have never been to a performance of any kind, probably theatre, dance, or music, because they are uncomfortable with the audience situation which they have to experience. These are people who may have some kind of Tourette's or autism. They are people who have problems of hearing, problems of sight, ADD perhaps. And certain companies in the UK are now bringing in the concept of the relaxed performance, which, may be once a fortnight in a run. And basically, everyone who runs the venue, everyone who is creating the performance, everyone involved, has to understand what the nature of relaxed means. It is wonderfully accommodating, therefore, to a different kind of responsiveness from audiences. There may be movement, there may be noise, there may be people coming in and out. And actually what people are finding there is that it's not just a question of tolerance, it's actually a question of reanimating those performances. And many performers say that these performances are now the most live and the most raw and the most meaningful they do. And we have helped try to bring this concept to, first of all, we did some seminars in New York, and I was thrilled to see that, the BAM, the Public, the Lincoln Center, and many others very readily and very willingly came to these seminars, and I've gone back and they are beginning to introduce the concept of relaxed performance. So I think I'm really encouraged by the receptivity to diversify the nature of audience, not just the nature of performer.
It's fabulous. Marshall, a bright spot.
3 quick things. The first thing is, I have to say, on a reflection of Sphinx, and I came to the first SphinxCon in 2013, I just love the energy of this organization. and all of you here, because there's always such a fantastically positive feel about that. Please don't lose that. I love the way people turn up to the microphone and just kind of talk and sing at us, and I think that's fantastic. I really think that's wonderful. The second thing I was going to say was just a nice positive story. There's been a lot of talk in the last couple of days about repertoire and about bringing the right compositions on. And just one nice anecdotal tale, which is there's a half Nigerian, half Irish double bass player in the UK called Chichi Nwanuko, extraordinary player, amazing player. And a number of years ago, over a decade ago, I went to her because I was then managing the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, and I'd found a wonderful composer, black composer called Chevalier de Saint-Georges, who came from the Caribbean. And I said to Chichi, this looks interesting. Have a look at this composer. We're going to program him with some Mozart. And she went off, and she didn't understand why. And she came back and said, black composer, and she's a black double bass player. And that started her on a journey which has ended up with her starting the first black orchestra in the UK and in Europe, which had its premiere last year. I don't know, were you at the concert there? It was one of the great concerts, I thought. Fantastic atmosphere. Sphinx is going to partner with that, and it's going to, in September, be around, I hope, and Aaron will be there at that next one.
What's the orchestra called, the UK?
Chineke, Chineke. And watch out for it, because it's going to be one of the big powerhouses, in Europe in the next few years. I'm quite sure. Chichi I used to play in double bass. She plays double bass. I used to play in a chamber group with her. And we'd go and play in concerts, and people would say, "Great concert! I love coming to the concerts Chichi's playing in." She was one of those people that really embraces. But anyway, you can't always know the great things that come from those tiny things like this repertoire question, which I think is such an important one. Third thing I was just going to say was I'm thinking back to 2013, the first time that this conference came together. And I'm thinking back to the last words of the conference, which came from Aaron. And if I remember rightly, he quoted Picasso, words to the effect that action is the foundational key to all success. And the thing I find when I come here is, you know why you're here. You know actually what you want to do, and you know when it needs doing, yesterday. What you really have to focus on is how. That's the question. And so I wonder if it would be great if the next conferences really focus in on, okay, guys, let's roll up our sleeves and talk seriously about how do we do this.
Excellent. Thank you. Rob.
And really to echo what Marshall said, one of the things that's really struck me about this conference has been the comments that have come from the floor. At each of the kind of panel discussions that I've attended, there have been remarkable things that have been said from you, from us, the community. As Marshall said, you know what needs to be done, and you have it within you to do it. And all that there is for me and for us to do is just to encourage you to step out there and make the change that you believe can happen. Huge thanks to Arthur and Aaron for hosting this space. And what they've done is they've created a scaffold and a space for us all to have ideas and to dream big. And I just want to congratulate all of you for participating, for showing up, for checking yourselves, and for encouraging us to check ourselves and our preconceptions. So well done. I think you've done a great job.
That's excellent. Well, I think those are perfect words. You guys are all about to take a 2-hour break to go get dinner on your own. Be back here at 8 o'clock for an extraordinary closing plenary. And please help me thank this panel for the final comments.